All the folks in Tennessee are as faithful as can be, and they know the Bible teaches what is right. They believe in God above and His great undying love, and they know they are protected by His might. Then to Dayton came a man with his new idea so grand, and he said, we came from monkeys long ago. But in teaching his belief, Mr. Stokes found only grief, for they would not let their old religion go.
The trial and the Scopes event was, in fact, I believe, the first deliberately staged mass media event in modern times. And this is much more visible today, I think, in retrospect, than it was, the discussions of it certainly were 50 years ago or 40 years ago. So I want to talk about the nature of that particular trial as an example of a turning point, which it was. And I want to discuss why it was such a turning point in terms of American church history and religious history, and to some somewhat limited extent, also political history. Now, when I talk about a turning point of this magnitude, I have 5 things in mind. And because this happens to be a covenantal issue, the 5 points of the covenant are in my mind just about all the time anyway, so let's go through them. First of all, as a turning point, I'm talking about a defining issue theologically. That is, with respect to the nature of God. Secondly, it was a defining issue because of the nature of the combat between representatives of each of the theological positions. In the third case, there was a fundamental legal issue at stake. In the fourth point, there was another trial that was the more important trial, which was in the court of public opinion. And finally, an inheritance was at stake, what I have called a cultural inheritance of the United States that was clearly on the line for 2 weeks, and that I believe for at least half a century was settled as a result of the trial. Now let's talk about the defining issue theologically. The fundamental issue that was at stake in that trial was the question of sovereignty. And really it was the question not so much just of sovereignty, but of whose sovereignty. It was an issue over the sovereignty of God versus the sovereignty of man. Man as a representative of nature in a Darwinian sense, nature being unplanned, random, with no purpose until man appeared. Now that's always the footnote of all Darwinian thought. Non-purposeful nature, through random mutations and change, produced purpose-driven man. That's the ringer. That's the trick of the Darwinian system. It's not that the universe is without purpose. It is that it was without purpose until the appearance of man. And man, having made a leap of being, has a mind, and because man has a mind, now can direct the processes of nature and understand nature. So what in Darwinian terms originally is presented to the public as man, the tiny, late-appearing creature, the product of random evolutionary forces, becomes man, the directing processing, thinking, planning agent who brings meaning to the universe. Except they don't usually tell you that in the same paragraph. That comes later in the book. So there was a defining issue on the nature of sovereignty. Who supplies order to the universe? Is it God or is it random nature? Who supplies order to society? Is it God or is it planning Darwinian man who represents nature? That was the issue. Who supplies meaning in a purposeless universe? Is it God? The Darwinian says no, because that would imply purpose for the universe. Is it man? The Darwinian says yes, because through evolutionary forces, man now can ascribe meaning to events around him. He is the source of meaning. Now, this obviously was not brought out in the court. This was obviously not brought out in the great debates that were taking place at the time in the media. But this is the theological issue: who is sovereign? And it is the same debate that takes place today. It will be the same debate that goes on until the final judgment. This question of man's sovereignty will be continuing in whatever guise in the future that comes. Whoever will be watching this DVD, however far in the future, there will be a battle in society, whenever you're listening to this, over the issue of sovereignty. Is it God or is it man? That's not going to change till final judgment. Now, secondly, there were representative combatants in a way that is almost unique in American history, because it basically came down to two men. And that rarely happens when a fundamental point is decided in terms of the debate of two men. Both gifted, both lawyers, both famous, both caught into this event almost, I wouldn't say randomly, but certainly in an unplanned way in terms of what men had planned the event of this trial, and I'll get into that. There was Clarence Darrow, who was a radical humanist, skeptic, and an agnostic so pushy you might as well call him an atheist. Darrow's point was not that he didn't know if there was a God. Darrow's point was that you don't know if there's a God. And he made that clear through his career. He's been described as the last of the American village atheists, and it's pretty much what he was, and self-consciously so. He had been a defender the year before in one of the most famous trials in American history, the Leopold and Loeb case, where two absolutely perverse teenagers tortured to death a child. And Darrow was called in to defend them. They would have been given the death penalty, and Darrow got him off with life imprisonment, claiming essentially non-responsibility because they'd been reading Nietzsche and it was really Nietzsche's fault. He was anti-death penalty, and I once, in doing research on this many years ago, found a statement that he made. He said there's only one person he never wanted on a jury. He would not want under any circumstances a Presbyterian. He said those people will go for the death penalty every time. That was an earlier era, perhaps, of Presbyterians. So he knew what he was up against. He, as a lawyer, he really did know. It was the Christians who were his problem. In his concept of justice and responsibility, the Christians were his problem. On the other side was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, unknown to most people, especially Christians, was the most radical political candidate who ever ran for president before him or after him. There was no one remotely close of a major candidate as far to the left as William Jennings Bryan. And he knew that and bragged about it, and would take no guff from liberals who would go after him for his views on evolution. He would always challenge them. Where were you on control of all big business by municipalities in the state. Where were you? And he'd list this long laundry list of left-wing issues that he had campaigned on. He was an opponent of evolution, obviously, and he was regarded as a fundamentalist by the general population. In fact, he was a Presbyterian, which generally you did not regard Presbyterianism as a form of fundamentalism. He, however, had become a Presbyterian in a unique way. He had, as a child, seen a Baptist baptism. He was terrified of water. And when he found out that he could become a Christian church member without getting dunked in a Presbyterian church, he chose Presbyterianism. From a theological standpoint, he was indeed a fundamentalist. There's no question about it. But he knew enough about water to say, sprinkling is okay with God, it's okay with me. That literally was the big hook for his joining the Presbyterian Church. And he joined the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which tended to be, theologically speaking, a less rigorous creedal denomination. Now, what was the legal issue at stake? The legal issue at stake in 1925 was whether or not the public had the right to control the content of the curriculum in a tax-supported institution. That was the legal issue. And Bryan said the public should have that control because he was a believer, absolute total believer in democracy, as really, I would almost say, as no other candidate in American history. A lot of them mouthed it. A lot of politicians give verbal affirmation of democracy. Bryan held it about as close to a religious principle as anyone who has ever received the nomination for president. He really did believe in it. He believed almost, well, he once described the doctrine of election, the Presbyterian doctrine, as God is out there telling you about salvation, and you vote like in election whether you're going to believe it or not. That was his doctrine of election. Darrow and those against him mouthed the language of democracy and did not believe it for 5 seconds, especially when it came to education. And they needed to stop him, and we'll get into why. Now, with respect to the court of public opinion, in retrospect, it's almost amazing what took place in 1925. It was July of 25. Reporters from all over the world streamed into Dayton, Tennessee. Hundreds of them. It was the first trial ever to be broadcast on radio. H.L. Mencken came from the Baltimore Sun, the most famous of all editorial writers, the most skeptical, probably in terms of verbal ability, the most gifted, a master of the English language as probably no newspaper man ever before or since. He wrote the book, The American Language. I mean, he was an amazing man in terms of his mastery of language. And he had a vendetta. He came to get Bryan. There was a battle of words, and the words were eloquent on both sides. And it was a battle with respect to words that he was determined, that is, Bryan, was determined to defend God's position, and Darrow was determined to have that position ridiculed. And Mencken had the same goal. Now finally, fifth point, there was an inheritance at stake, a cultural inheritance. Part of that inheritance was, what about your children? What will your children be taught in the tax-supported compulsory school system? That was the issue. And secondarily, there was the question of what would be the political influence of Christians, of what they would have called fundamentalist Christians, Bible-believing Christians. And remember, the Christians, with the progressives, had gotten prohibition passed only 7 years before. And so the Christians as a voting bloc were powerful enough when working with the progressive humanists in a joint operation to change the United States Constitution. This was not a small voting bloc in 1925. This is a powerful voting bloc and perceived as such. The question is, would that voting bloc continue to exercise decisive political influence? Now, why Dayton? This is the part of the story very few people know. It was a public relations stunt. It was called together by some of the town council people, leaders in the community, businessmen who wanted to get Dayton on the map. It was very self-conscious. One of them was a lawyer and read that the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, wanted to have a test case of the law against teaching evolution in the public school system. And they realized if the ACLU was going to come in and they guaranteed to bankroll all the prosecution, they wanted a piece of the action. They thought this would get the town some publicity. Well, surely they were right about that one. More publicity, I think, than they ever wanted or would have wanted in terms of the nature of the publicity from that point on. So the lawyer in town, who was also a local businessman, decided they needed to get somebody who would serve as the lightning rod who would be prosecuted. And they had a man. They went to him. His name was John Scopes. Now, John Scopes was a young man, about 25. He was the football coach. Technically, he was the head of the science department. So they were using the football coach to teach in the science department. That shows how radically different it was these days, because today they always put the football coaches in the history department. But in those days, they actually put them in the physics department. They're smarter coaches, I suspect. But he didn't teach biology. But one day, the principal of the school, who did teach the biology class, was absent. So they brought Scopes in to be in the class that day to teach biology. And so the lawyer who was rigging the system up said, well, John, you taught the course that day. Yeah, well, did you use this textbook? Hold out the text. Well, yeah, that was the textbook. Well, then, wouldn't it be possible to say that you taught evolution in the classroom? Scopes says, well, I don't know, I guess. Well, how would you like to be prosecuted for having taught evolution in the classroom? Because the ACLU's got a strategy. You're going to get convicted. It's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. Scopes says, okay. Now, this meant they could never put him on the stand, because the first question that would have probably been asked, technically, that question should have been, well, did you teach evolution? Well, if he was the prosecutor and he knew probably he didn't, he couldn't ask that question, which would make it real difficult to get a conviction in the court. So they never intended to put Scopes on the witness stand. And he later admitted in private that he wasn't sure he'd ever done it, and he would have had to say that if he'd been under oath. Now, why Bryan? Why was Bryan so important? Remember, at the early stage, Bryan wasn't in on the deal, neither was Darrow. It was just some good old boys. In fact, one of them had the unfortunate condition of, at his birth, his mother died, and they named him for his mother, and his mother was named Sue. His name was Sue Hicks, and he was the original boy named Sue. He had grown up with that albatross around his neck. Seemed to do all right with it. So it was just a bunch of good old boys who were going to do this for publicity's sake. All of a sudden, Bryan is nearby, and they announce this, and the ACLU says, yeah, let's go ahead with this. We got this case. Somebody writes to Bryan and says, well, Mr. Bryan, you're a lawyer. Why don't you help prosecute this? Well, now this is a problem, because this is not an ACLU guy. This is a real guy. And he came in, he decided to do it. Well, at that point, Darrow gets wind of it. Darrow wants a piece of it. So now it's two of the most famous lawyers in America going at it. Now, why is Bryan so important? I'll tell you why. Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, as far as I can determine from my knowledge of American history, is the only man who you could say in a textbook absolutely and completely transformed American politics and absolutely, at least for 50 years, transformed American religion. Separately, on two different occasions, actually multiple occasions. Bryan, in 1896, came as the last speaker of the Democratic National Convention for president and gave what is unquestionably the most famous, the most powerful, and the most revolutionary nominating speech to get the nomination that has ever been given in American history. And most people even today know that phrase. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. Now, the Democratic Party had been a low-tariff party, a gold standard party, a low-tax party, and the existing Democrat who was the president, Cleveland, at that time had vetoed more bills, spending bills, than any president in history, and is still in second place, and only in second place to Franklin Roosevelt in the number of vetoes, and that's because Roosevelt had 3.5 terms, and Cleveland only had 2. He was the veto mayor of Buffalo, and he became the veto president, and he was a strong gold standard, low-tax man, and one year they ran a surplus in the budget, and he said, send it back to the taxpayers. That was the last president of the United States ever to go forward while in office on that policy. And this was a war for the Democratic Party, which had been, from the beginning, a limited government party. And Bryan wanted to make it as close to a socialist party as you could get away with. And he got the nomination in 1896. Now, he lost. And then he lost in 1900. And then he lost in 1908. He had 3 shots at it. And at the end of 08, he said to the reporters, I feel like a drunk who has been thrown out of the saloon. I don't think those people want me in there. Which was true. But in doing it, he had transformed the Democratic Party into the Democratic Party that we know today. A government-oriented, regulatory, progressive movement party. And so in 1912, when the election took place, all 3 candidates were absolutely committed to the progressive political movement. They were all big government men. Wilson, and of course, Teddy Roosevelt, and Taft, the president, they were all big government men. And the country really has never recovered. The country has never gone back from what happened in 1912, and Bryan had made that possible. So he was the greatest radical that we had in the country, certainly at that time, and at losing 3 times, he was the biggest loser in the country. Now, he did one other thing. Actually, he didn't do it, his brother did it. His brother, Charles, invented the first political mailing list. And it was so big and so effective that Charles Bryan was so feared that in 1924, the Democratic Party made him the nominee for Vice President of the United States just a few months before the trial. Now, they lost, but he was that powerful because of that mailing list. Bryan was a rich man because of that mailing list. I mean, his equivalent income in some years was the equivalent today of $500,000 a year, except in those days there was no income tax. So he did well with that mailing list and the speaking. Now, the reason why he was so crucial is that in 1921 he wrote a book called In His Image. And In His Image was a powerful book. He read Darwin, he understood Darwin, he didn't like Darwin. But the interesting thing is this, he really didn't care about the evolution issue with respect of, well, did man come over a long period of time or not? He didn't care. He wasn't tied to anything like a 6-day creation. Let me tell you why he didn't like Darwin. In The Descent of Man, Darwin makes the following statement. Bryan quotes it in chapter 4 of In His Image, and he says, "This is why we must stop the Darwinian movement. Quote from Darwin, "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who form a weak constitution and would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has studied the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man." Now, Bryan, as a liberal, not humanist, but humanitarian interventionist, who believes in vaccination, who believes in asylums for the poor, and anything else the government can do for poor people, he reads this and he goes ballistic. And he says, this is an affront to humanity to say a thing like this. And he says, this is consistent with Darwin's view of the origin of man. So he went on the rampage, and he began to call for legislatures around the country to pass anti-evolutionary laws, and I think at least a dozen had considered it. 3 had done it. The strongest one was this one in Tennessee. He was the guy behind the whole movement to get Darwinism out of the public schools. Now, he never went after the colleges. He was not a man to bite off more than he could chew. Well, actually, he was a man to bite off more than he could chew, but at least he thought he could chew and swallow this particular fight. And he had made this his cause. This was his new cause. He was done politically. Now, this is a man, you understand, he had been Secretary of State of the United States. And he was the first Secretary of the State of the United States in 1915 to resign under protest because he said, Wilson is taking us into war with Europe, which is exactly what Wilson was doing. So he had had that much power, and he had walked out on principle. In 1923, he had run for the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church on this issue, and he lost by 24 votes out of about 800. So this man was the biggest loser in American history, no question about it. But when he lost for principle's sake. He fought battles for principle's sake. And he was enraged at Darwin. And he said, he made it public. He said, I am not fighting over all these technical issues of biology. He said, I am fighting against the ethical perversity of the Darwinian system. Well, the attacks began on the press, from the press, beginning in 1922, and it was constant. They went after him to try to destroy him because of what he was threatening. What was he threatening? He was threatening to allow the voters to have a say with respect to the content of what went in the textbooks of the public schools, which they were compelled to support. And that was considered an outrageous suggestion, and they went after him. And I mean the big ones, the New York Times, the largest newspapers of the country went after him, hammer and tong, week after week, going after him. In 1922, Harry Emerson Fosdick preached one of the most famous sermons of the day called Shall the Fundamentalists Win? And it was over this fight. Shall the fundamentalists win? John D. Rockefeller Jr. read that and said, we've got to send this to every pastor in the country. And they did. They changed the name of it to kind of tone it down a little bit. They send that to every pastor in the country. They were determined to get Fosdick's message out. Liberal, humanist theologian who was a Baptist masquerading as a Presbyterian at the time. And it was against him that the battle began in the Presbyterian Church to try to get this man out. All in reaction to get Bryan. Now, at the trial, the issue degenerated real fast into, we're not really after Scopes, we're really after Bryan. And it went back and forth. In fact, Mencken had actually approached Darrow earlier, and Mencken had said, this has got nothing to do, and he used the words, nothing to do with this yap teacher. We've got to get Bryan. And so they went after him. Now, the people in town, contrary to the later movie, were very gracious to all the reporters, and they said so. Not the people. The reporters said, yeah, they welcomed us. They were very nice. They were friendly. There was no problem. They enjoyed having the publicity at the time. But it was true, it was no doubt true, that the textbook, this Darwinian textbook, had been used in the classroom, and Scopes had at least been in the classroom. Now let's listen a little to what was science in American classrooms in 1925. I want to quote from the textbook in question, which was George William Hunter's book, A Civic Biology, which had been published in 1914. I want to remind you of what it was in 1925. This in the name of science. The races of man. At present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. Can you imagine in a public school today if a biology teacher got up with this textbook and said, now kids, here's the reality, went through that? It gets worse. Speaking of people with low IQs, the author writes, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibility of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with some success in this country. Now, what does it mean, meeting with success in this country? I'll tell you what it means. It means beginning in the state of Indiana in 1909 and progressing through state after state in the United States, there were compulsory sterilization laws if a woman was caught in a low IQ rating. They'd sterilize these women by the thousands. Within 10 years of this trial, the Nazis, almost word for word, copied the same laws out of the American state governments on legalization of the forced sterilization of women. And you think, well, this would never get by the Supreme Court. 2 years after the trial in 1927, a case went to the court, Buck v. Bell, where a woman, low IQ, had been forcibly sterilized, and they told her they were taking out her appendix. That went to the United States Supreme Court, and the court voted 8-1 to legalize that action. And in response to that, the famous Darwinian liberal, who more than any other man was probably responsible for putting Darwinism into the law schools, Holmes, made the statement, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Now, in fact, this woman had borne a child. She died fairly young in childhood, but the child, her teacher said, was a bright child. Didn't matter to the Supreme Court of the United States. Because in the United States at this time, there were many believers in what is known as eugenics, which is the manipulation of the human race to create something like unto a super race. And the developer of that philosophy was a man named Francis Galton. And Francis Galton was a genius mathematician who was Charles Darwin's cousin. And he read Darwin's book, and he wrote his own book called Hereditary Genius. And Darwin, in a later edition of Descent of Man, has a favorable footnote to it. Francis Galton was knighted in 1909. And it was his view that you could manipulate the race of man genetically to create some new kind. They didn't call him Superman. That was a little too Nietzschean for them. But that was what they meant. That normal biology was not enough, that the state had to intervene in some way, and science had to intervene in some way now to give direction to the human race. You see the pitch? Nature's not good enough anymore. Random development, that's not good enough anymore. Because man is taking over, through his knowledge of science, the whole directionality of humanity. This was the new move of Darwinism. And it had been going on for over 20 years. Really closer to 30. This was the widespread belief. And among the very rich and the very elite of this country, including the Rockefeller family, this belief in eugenics was widespread. And it remained widespread until the end of the 1930s. And about the time that some of the stories began filtering over from Germany as to how that particular doctrine was being applied and political correctness began to shift, this was what the elite of this country believed. Now, in the actual case, in the actual debates between Darrow and Bryan, the issue came up, of course, of whether or not the Bible was to be accepted or whether or not evolution was to be accepted. And in an absolutely unprecedented move, Darrow called Bryan to the witness stand as an expert in religion. Now, this is just unheard of, that the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney, instead of battling it out, the defense attorney calls the prosecuting attorney to say, well, sit in the chair and I'll cross-examine you. And the deal was that the next day, that Bryan would be able to get Darrow into the stand. So this cross-examination began. Now, in, of course, the famous movie, Bryan comes out looking like a fool. Well, in the actual prosecution and cross-examination, he held his own. But it did become clear that he was an age-day creationist. He would not stick with the idea of God's creating the universe in a six literal 24-hour day period. And you think, well, that doesn't sound very conservative. Let me tell you, in 1925, that was as conservative as it got. In 1925, as far as I can determine, and in researching the topic, there was only one man with an advanced degree in the country who was arguing for the six-day creation. He was a Seventh-day Adventist named George McCready Price. Every other Protestant leader, no matter how conservative the church, no matter how conservative the statement of faith that he had to swear to, which in fact in the case of Presbyterianism did affirm a six-day creation, not one of them believed it. And they hadn't believed it in at least 100 years. And in fact, if you look back, they hadn't believed it for over 200 years. Six-day creationism was not believed by college-educated men, pastors, teachers, anybody. We live in an era which in my time I have seen the shift, and I'll get into it in a later presentation, that prior to about 1950, and certainly prior to 1940, there's virtually nobody who would publicly attest to a six-day creation, except McCready Price, and maybe a couple of Lutheran scholars. I mean, virtually nobody. There was no creationist movement as we know it today. So the fact that Bryan did not affirm what we would see as a conservative defense of the faith from an historical standpoint is really completely understandable. There was nobody to back him up at that point, except Price. The judge threw it out. He said, this is going nowhere. This has got nothing to do with the issue at hand of whether this law should be enforced or not. And he threw it out. Of course, the jury had heard it. And in throwing it out, Darrow got off the hook. He wasn't going to be cross-examined the next day, and that upset Bryan, you can imagine. And then Darrow turned to the jury and said, ladies and gentlemen, and he's a defense attorney, you must convict. And they went out, didn't stay very long, came back in, guilty. $100 fine. Now, it's not so much in today's money, but in those days it was, $1,000, $1,500, something in that range. Now, nobody was really after Scopes. Nobody was after Scopes. Bryan had already said, hey, I'll pay the fine. He'd already agreed to that. What was it about? It was about getting a conviction which could then be appealed to the Supreme Court and overturned. And that had been the plan from day one. But because the defense said convict and threw the case, there was no summation, no final arguments, and Bryan couldn't make his point, which was that the public has the right to say where its tax money goes, which he'd been saying publicly at this point for 3 years. And he couldn't get his day in court. So Scopes was convicted. It went to the appellate court in the state, and the appellate court threw out the conviction on a minor technicality. And that meant, since it had been thrown out at the appellate court level, there was nothing for the ACLU to do to appeal to the United States Supreme Court, so the ACLU effectively lost the case, even though technically the ACLU won the case. And that really is where it remained until the 1960s. That was the last time this was broached on a national campaign, until the 60s, when it went back up. And is continuing to go up, as you know. I mean, these court cases are continuing to go on. The political battle continues to go on. At the end of the trial, which at that point there'd been a conviction, but of course it had not gone to the appellate court yet. But at the end of the trial, which was third week of July 1925, the media had gotten what it wanted, which was a circus. Mencken had used his mastery of the English language to report on the trial about the bumpkins and so forth. Hundreds of reporters had gotten the taste of blood because they had beaten Bryan. There's no question about it. He had technically won the case, but he had unquestionably lost in the court of public opinion. Now, this was an orchestrated campaign. There's no question about that. And in terms of real mass media, it wasn't the first time there'd been mass media orchestrated campaigns. Certainly the Spanish-American War was such a campaign. I mean, Hearst had sent down one of his reporters to Cuba, and the reporter wrote back and said, "There's no war in Cuba." And Hearst wrote back and said, "I'll supply the war, you just report." And he did. So there'd been mass media campaigns to achieve a goal, but there had never been a mass media campaign, as far as I can tell, to destroy one man's reputation in an overall campaign to finally get off their backs the millions of fundamentalists who did not approve of what was going on in the public school system. You have to get a representative. It's the battle of representatives. Now, theologically, what's the battle in our case? Are you a son of the first Adam or are you a son of the second Adam? Are you going to be represented on Judgment Day by Adam in his rebellion or Christ in his obedience? It's a representative legal issue. Who do you want as your representative? We always fight by representatives. Representation is crucial to organizing any kind of a fight. It doesn't matter what field you're in. There's always someone who represents the good guys, and there's someone who represents the bad guys. Bryan stayed in Dayton for a few more days, went to church on Sunday morning, the following Sunday morning, and died that afternoon. With the death of Bryan, they really got what they wanted. They had stopped him literally cold. He had been beaten in front of the media. He had been pummeled by the media, even though he'd won the case technically. He had lost his reputation at that point because the left was not about to continue to cheer him just because he had fought virtually all of their causes for the past 30 years almost, 28 years. He was persona non grata because he went after the two issues, the two crucial issues of America at that time. And those issues were, who's God? That is, who represents the story of God, Darwinism or the Bible? Who is God? Who is sovereign? And the other issue is, who will control the public school system? And his opponents understood full well what the issues were, and they had to stop him, and they did. Now, since that time, the war has continued, and the battle has gone on as to who's going to control the flow of funds into the public school, and then secondarily, what's the content of the education going to be? Is it a democracy, or is it an elitist tyranny in which the sons and daughters of American Christians are put into a system by compulsory law financed by their parents to be taught Darwinism? And there's no question who won that battle. That battle has been settled since 1925. I contend that it was this event that was the turning point for the next 50 years in the nature of American Protestant conservative resistance. It was this event, the public humiliating of Bryan in what was essentially legally a lost cause anyway, that public pummeling of the man who was the representative, or was made the representative, and I think legitimately was the representative of American fundamentalism, his defeat, so complete in the media, paralyzed American conservative Protestant Christians from that point on. And it handed over to the humanists who controlled now the entire educational system up through the colleges, who controlled the flow of funds, and maybe most important, controlled the textbooks. It handed to them the next generation. Because if you control what the children learn in the schools, if you control the flow of information, you control people. And this was understood clearly by both sides. What was extraordinary in retrospect, and really to me is extraordinary today, is that the vast majority of the fundamentalist Christians who were represented by Bryan shrugged their shoulders at that point and said, okay, we lost it. We must be wrong. We'll put up with it. And with the exception of a few basically immigrant groups, the Dutch in the Reformed church circles, some Lutherans, especially Missouri Synod, and the Roman Catholic Church, with the parochial school system, with the exception of those people, there was no further resistance. Those small groups pulled their kids out and said, we will not let them in. You're not going to get our kids. But the vast majority of the people who had been represented by William Jennings Bryan acquiesced to what was clearly an anti-democratic, elitist, humanist takeover of the most important single institution in the United States, the public schools, which was really America's only established church by that time. And they shrugged their shoulders and they said, well, I guess that's the end of the fight. And they continued to send their children into the schools for the next, 40, 50 years? A lot of them still doing it. That was the shocker. That was the extent of the defeat. And I'll be covering more of the defeat, of the implications of this defeat, in the next presentation.
All the folks in Tennessee are as faithful as can be, and they know the Bible teaches what is right. They believe in God above and His great undying love, and they know they are protected by His might. Then to Dayton came a man with his new idea so grand, and he said, we came from monkeys long ago. But in teaching his belief, Mr. Stokes found only grief, for they would not let their old religion go. You may find a new belief, it will only bring you grief, for a house that's built on sand is sure to fall. And wherever you may turn, there's a lesson you will learn, that the old religion's better after all. Then the folks throughout the land saw his house was built on sand, and they said, we will not listen anymore. So they told him he was wrong, and it wasn't very long till he found that he was barred from every door. Oh, you must not doubt